Sejam bem-vindos a esta conferência inaugural do curso de doutoramento em História, do Departamento de História aqui da Faculdade de Ciências Sociais e Humanas, que passámos a designar Conferência José Medeiros Ferreira, em homenagem a este nosso querido colega, amigo, professor. Foi de facto uma figura muito marcante a vários títulos para muitos de nós. Tivemos o privilégio de ser seus alunos, também seus amigos, enfim, e é uma figura também cuja grandeza política e cívica é de conhecimento de todos. Enfim, várias homenagens lhe foram ainda feitas em vida, isso também é uma coisa que com a qual nos congratulamos, ainda foi possível homenageá-lo em vida, e ultimamente também tem-se realizado várias iniciativas de tributo à sua memória e também de continuação um pouco do interesse pelos temas nos quais se notabilizou o José Medeiros Ferreira. Ele foi uma pessoa que, mesmo até ao fim dos seus dias, se manteve extremamente ativo do ponto de vista intelectual e também cívico. Eu agradeço também muito a presença da doutora Maria Emília Borderó dos Santos aqui nesta cerimónia, também muito nos sensibiliza. Estamos também muito gratos ao professor David Priestland por estar aqui hoje, por aceitar fazer esta palestra. Ainda por cima, ele teve uma solicitação recente para ir à China, fazer um conjunto de palestras também sobre esta temática da história do comunismo e, portanto, acabou de fazer um voo intercontinental. Isto é um pouco exigente, mas ficamos também muito reconhecidos por isso. No flyer que circulou sobre a conferência, vocês podem ler várias informações sobre o seu percurso académico. O professor David Priestland é docente, investigador na Universidade de Oxford, no Reino Unido. Curiosamente, já esteve aqui na nossa faculdade há uns anos atrás, quando fizemos uma conferência sobre o fim da União Soviética, e ele foi também, digamos assim, o orador convidado principal dessa conferência. O professor David Priestland começou por estudar no âmbito da história da União Soviética o período do Stalinismo. Tem um livro chamado Stalinism and the Politics of Mobilization, publicado na década passada. Depois publicou um livro que terá granjeado um maior reconhecimento internacional, chamado The Red Flag, The History of Communism, já traduzido para português, publicado no Brasil e também em Portugal. Mais recentemente publicou um livro muito interessante, Merchant, Soldier, Sage, A New History of Power, um livro mais, digamos assim, mais breve, de caráter mais ensaístico, sobre como é que, no fundo, as ideias, os valores da ideologia do mercado livre, no fundo, têm tido também outros competidores, e o que é que podemos, digamos assim, adivinhar para o futuro em função da mais recente crise global do capitalismo. É um livro que já está traduzido para português, embora não publicado em Portugal, publicado no Brasil pela editora Companhia das Letras. A conferência de hoje do professor David Priestland é, enfim, como não podia deixar de ser, sobre também a história da Revolução de Outubro de 1917, mas também sobre o seu significado contemporâneo, Visions of October 1917, from Bolshevism to Post-Crisis Capitalism. Portanto, até que ponto é que os valores, a ruptura de 1917 têm alguma ressonância contemporânea? O que é que isto pode significar para este período de grande turbulência política e social que, no fundo, ainda estamos a viver, desde a crise do subprime, a crise do Lehman Brothers de 2008. Enfim, pareceu-nos trazer uma pessoa como o David Priestland, pareceu-nos interessante a vários títulos, pelo valor da sua obra e também, evidentemente, um pouco por esta coincidência temporal da efeméride de outubro de 1917. O professor José Medeiros Ferreira não foi uma pessoa que tivesse investigado muito a história do comunismo, não escreveu propriamente muito sobre a história do comunismo, era um assunto que ele abordava, evidentemente, nas suas aulas, mas, evidentemente, enquanto também ator político, o seu percurso se cruzou, de alguma maneira, também com o fenómeno do comunismo. E há um ponto, digamos assim, em que, curioso, estava a falar disto há pouco, Maria Emília, a trajetória da grande figura da Revolução de Outubro, Lenin, se cruza um pouco com a trajetória de José Medeiros Ferreira, que ambos foram exilados políticos na mesma cidade europeia, em períodos diferentes, evidentemente, em Genebra. Lenin viveu, largos anos ainda na Suíça antes de surgir no palco revolucionário russo em 1917. Ele esteve em Berna, sobretudo Zurique também, mas de vez em quando também ia a Genebra e ia a um café, Brasserie Landolt, numa zona de Genebra que fica ao pé da universidade, uma zona também muito frequentada por estudantes, Rue de Lacandole, número 2. E nessa Brasserie Landolt era também um sítio onde socializavam alguns exilados políticos portugueses em Genebra nos anos 60. Portanto, José Medeiros Ferreira, António Barreto, Eurico de Figueiredo, Ana Benavente. E mais tarde, uns anos mais tarde, a Câmara Municipal de Genebra mandou colocar lá uma placa exatamente alusiva a essa presença dos exilados portugueses, que depois estiveram também muito ligados ao 25 de Abril. Foi um tributo da cidade de Genebra a essas pessoas. Eu, curiosamente, calhou estar em Genebra neste verão e, um pouco naquelas viagens sentimentais que às vezes fazemos, queria encontrar esta Brasserie Landolt, ver onde é que estava a mesa do Lenin, a placa dos exilados portugueses, mas antes de me aproximar do local, consultei o Google Maps para ver exatamente como é que eu chegava até lá, do sítio onde estava, e o Google Maps, em vez de me sinalizar Brasserie Landolt, estava sempre a sinalizar Takumi. E de facto eu apercebi-me que já não existe Brasserie Landolt, é um restaurante japonês de sushi chamado Takumi. A Maria Emília diz-me que antes do restaurante Takumi havia um restaurante chamado FBI. Portanto, há aqui um conjunto de ironias históricas, enfim, interessantes. Lições cujo significado ainda estou a ruminar acerca delas. So, David, without further ado, sorry for this rather long introduction, with an anecdote that I'll later tell you about it. Now the floor is yours. We're all eager to listen to your talk.
Great. Well, thank you. It's wonderful to be invited back to speak in Portugal, and it's a great honour to be giving this first lecture named for José Medeiros Ferreira, a historian who played such an important role in the history of modern Portugal. I often feel, I suppose I would say that, but I often feel the world might be a better place if more historians were involved in politics, and it wasn't just lawyers and economists who tend to run the world. But I suppose I would say that, wouldn't I? Now, José Medeiros Ferreira, of course, was not a historian of communism, but he himself played a part in the story I'll be telling, of course, from a more liberal socialist position rather than a communist one, and very much at the end of my story, when the legacy of October 1917 was waning. So, to start at the beginning of my story, but not quite at the beginning, I want to start with an image of 1917. Is it? Yeah, that's right. Yeah, that's right. An image of 1917 that was produced in 1927 for the first sort of big anniversary of the revolution in 1927. Now, not many of you would have heard of this film. This is a film poster, The End of St. Petersburg. It was produced at about the same time, for the same anniversary, as a film you probably will have heard of, Sergei Eisenstein's October. This is much less well known, but in a way, it is a more conventional view of the so-called visions, as I call them, of 1917 in the Bolshevik Party at the time, in 1927, for the 10th anniversary. It shows the working class hero. It shows the weaponry of war and revolution, and also the famous statue of Peter the Great in St. Petersburg, Petrograd, the so-called bronze horseman of Peter the Great. Now, a statue some of you who've been to Petersburg will know. And I think this image captures the essence of the story of the film. The hero of the film is this person, the peasant who becomes a worker in St. Petersburg. He comes to revolutionary consciousness. He and becomes connected with the Bolshevik Party. He fights on the front. He turns his arms on the Tsarist regime and helps to inaugurate a regime that replaces the old cruel form of modernity, the form of modernity represented by Peter the Great, because Peter the Great was seen as the first great westernizing Tsar of Russian history. And he was seen as a bringer of modernity, but a very cruel modernity. And the idea of the film is that the Bolsheviks are bringing a new, humane form of modernity with socioeconomic equality to Russia. And I would say that poster captures the three big ideas of the October Revolution at the time. That is, working class equality, military action, revolution, and modernity, modernization, particularly industrial modernization. And these are the ideas that had such an impact on the 20th century, the history of the 20th century. It was October, of course, as is commonly said, October the 1917 was the first revolution in the name of the working class. That created a new type of state, and with it the divisions over capitalism, anti-capitalism, the central battles between left and right over economics, capitalism and markets. If the French Revolution, of course, introduced concepts of left and right, but in a way the economic essence of capitalism and socialism were not so much of a central issue, the October Revolution placed that issue absolutely at the centre of global politics. So that is probably quite a conventional way of analysing the effects of the October Revolution, and it has much to it, but in some ways the influence of the October Revolution perhaps is slightly stranger than we might think. Because the images on this poster are about industrial workers in Russia. It stressed the industrial working class and its agency. It was very much about a big city, St. Petersburg in Europe. And the interesting question, I suppose, that arises is why did this vision of revolution that was very much about the working class, industrial working class and urban life in Europe, why did it have such an impact in the agrarian world, the developing world, where heavy industry, where the working class barely existed? You know, it was really in China, East Asia, various parts of so-called global south, where this image, this vision had so much influence. Also, how did this idea of revolution, which is all about revolution and revolutionary working classes, how did it legitimize state socialist regimes in the future that were in many respects very far from revolutionary? And why did this model of revolution appear like Marx's spectre, frightening Western liberal democratic societies, again, which were very far from revolutionary? And in this talk, I want to try and answer some of these questions by examining not what 1917 and October were historically, but looking at its legacy and how it was seen and imagined by various generations, by future generations, how these visions of different visions of 1917 affected the left's efforts to respond to the changing circumstances of the 20th century. And I want to argue that the success of the idea of October 1917 was not in its monolithic nature, but in its flexibility. We can identify a number of visions of 1917 which helped to inspire the left. And that will finally help me to ask, I suppose, whether there are any elements of those visions of 1917. Is it, in 1917, it's been pretty adaptable over the course of the 20th century. But are there any elements of that which remain relevant today in the aftermath of the financial crisis, which some people have argued might see some revival of the left? Nicolas Sarkozy was shown with a copy of Das Kapital in the aftermath of the financial crisis, and clearly we are seeing a sort of revival of the left. So what I want to look at are the different ways in which October has been interpreted over time, and then to ask whether there are any of those elements of October which are relevant today. Is the Russian Revolution finally over? As Fourier said of the French Revolution in 1978, he said the French Revolution is finally over in 1978. Is the Russian Revolution finally over, or does it survive? Now, the approach I want to use is as I said, what I'm interested in is not necessarily the socioeconomic forces behind revolution, but the image of revolution, the visions of revolution for future generations. That's not to say I don't think socioeconomic forces are important, they are. But I think also the legacies of October, the ways in which October was viewed, have been hugely influential in affecting revolutionaries, but in various different ways. And the events of 1917 and the broader events of the Russian Civil War, I suppose, the revolutionary wars of 1917 to 1920, 1921, I think offered a large number of disparate components that could be interpreted in different ways. The recent history books of the Russian Revolution, which have been published this year for the anniversary, thinking particularly of a book by Steve Smith on the Russian Revolution, emphasise that the revolution itself was made up of various different elements, various different forces. Of course, there was a worker revolution in the major cities. There were peasant rebellions in the countryside. There were anti-imperial uprisings in the non-Russian parts of the empire. So, and the events of 1917 could be seen in different ways, and they were seen in different ways, but I think we can identify 5 major elements, each of which became associated with a particular vision of revolution and revolutionary politics. Now, the first, as I have shown, is the sort of Pudovkin vision. That is, this is an urban revolution of industrial workers in the service of equality and industrial modernity. Now, in the revolutionary period itself, in 1917, this view of revolution appealed to some workers, but also many educated experts and intellectuals, technical people, who saw, even though they may have been a bit sceptical of Bolshevism initially, saw Bolshevism as a vehicle of industrial modernization, which the Tsarist regime, they believed, had not successfully achieved. So you know, if we look at the early Bolshevik regime, it did actually attract quite a lot of, not the old intellectuals, but, well, actually quite a lot of sort of old technical people, a lot of people involved in, you know, who were sort of left-wing intellectuals. Of course, it alienated many intellectuals as well, but it attracted quite some intellectuals who saw it as a way of promoting modernisation. In a way, this is a classic version of the classic Western or sort of 20th century alliance between workers and white-collar expert professionals. The second vision I want to show you is represented in another, the next. So this is the revolution as Peasant War. Now, this is an image, a famous picture by the artist Malevich, and it's called Red Cavalry, and it's a rather striking picture painting of red cavalry on the steppe in the Civil War. Now, much of 1917 and the Civil War following it involved peasant insurrection in pursuit of land redistribution. And in a way, I think the Bolsheviks' ability to survive, I think many historians would accept now, that the Bolsheviks, of course, succeeded in taking the major cities in 1917, but they did not, but the fact that they created the state owed much to their support among many peasants, but also to their military actions against the white forces in the Civil War. So in many ways, this was a military a revolution that was won by military means. This is something we also see in the Chinese Revolution as well, as I'll come on to. Now, this aspect of 1917, therefore, so this image of 1917 is one of peasant war, the heroism of simple peasants, and often the brutality of simple peasants, fighting in military units. Now, in the course of the 1920s, this was written about by the famous Russian writer Isaac Babel in his Red Cavalry, set of short stories, and also this Malevich picture of 1932 also, in a way, well, I suppose, sort of celebrates, or at least marks this aspect of the revolution. Now, this aspect of revolution overlapped with the third aspect of revolution, which I call the anti-feudal revolution, as they called it, and the anti-patriarchal revolution. Now, this is a poster of the time which shows Lenin cleans the earth of the unclean, or the dirty, I suppose. So you see him with a broom, and here are czars, capitalists, and church people. And so this was seen as, so what we have here is the view that Lenin is not just getting rid of capitalism, but he's getting rid of, the revolution is getting rid of the old so-called feudal aristocratic order run by kings and aristocrats, military aristocracy, warrior aristocracy of the period, and also the church. And this aspect of the revolution was very relevant to future many developing societies. Many intellectuals believed that their societies were held back by these highly hierarchical status, or aristocratic or hierarchical systems in China, because it was the sort of Confucian hierarchies, imperial hierarchies, and Confucian hierarchies. In other countries, it was other types of landowning aristocracies. So that was the other another aspect of the revolution, another image of how the revolution was perceived by the left. And this also was related to the anti-patriarchal revolution, which one sees again in many communist regimes, in the revolutionary periods of those regimes. And this is a picture of a Soviet woman and it says, what has the October Revolution given to working women and peasant women? And here we have the library, the workers' women's club, the care for children, and these things which the revolution claims to be giving women. So often the communists regarded themselves in the initial revolutionary stages as trying to overturn patriarchal relations as well as other relations. The fourth strand of 1917 is the anti-imperial strand, and here we have Ho Chi Minh at a meeting of the French Communist Party, and early communists after the October Revolution very much saw themselves as anti-imperial activists, particularly in the, for instance, the Lenin and the Bolsheviks sponsored the Baku Congress of Peoples of the East in 1920, which was an attempt to campaign or fight against the British and other empires. Of course, the Soviets themselves, you could argue, were recreating a type of Russian empire within the Soviet Union itself. And that became increasingly clear in the course of Soviet history. But certainly the many early revolutionaries and the Soviets themselves saw themselves as an anti-imperial force, and many left-wing nationalists in the imperial world saw the revolution as something that would help them. And we find many, the emergence of communism in nationalist movements throughout the developing world throughout the period. Now, this is the final and fifth type of revolution, if you could come to the next one, is the sort of avant-garde Bohemian revolution. Now, this was less prominent in October 1917 itself, a sort of connection, but many Bohemian, if you like, intellectuals at the time regarded the revolution as something that would help them, or that they could feel some sympathy with. This was a sort of cultural avant-garde of the period. Now here I have two different avant-garde paintings. This is Kandinski's painting Blue Crest, and this is George Gross painting, satirizing, as he saw it, the sort of the militarized bourgeoisie of Germany at the time. And so I suppose here we see two different kinds of cultural revolution, if you like. And one of them was an attempt to revolutionize aesthetics. Another was an attempt to both revolutionize aesthetics and use aesthetics to attack social hierarchies. And several radical intellectuals at the time regarded the revolution as something, again, that would in a way promote a revolution of the mind as well as a political revolution. Now, that is something which became rather disillusioned, particularly with the end of the 20s, when the Soviets engaged in a rather culturally conservative set of policies, particularly under Stalin in the 1930s. But in this early period, many cultural avant-gardists thought the revolution, sympathized with the Russian Revolution. So we have 5 very different visions of the revolution, and I'd argue that all 5 played a major role in the legacies of October in the following century. So if we think about what is the legacy of October, I think we've got to think of multiple legacies, and I think these are the 5 major ones. But however, the legacies changed over time. Some became more important at some times, others at other times. I would say the first 2 legacies, the Pudovkin workerist modernizing legacy and the Peasant War, were the most important aspects in Russia and in October itself, and in a way in much of the developing world as well. The anti-imperial legacy, the third, became very important globally, particularly after World War II. And this final legacy, this sort of more culturally libertarian, if you like. I don't know, it's a sort of culturally libertarian type of communism, of course, was not at all important after the 1930s in the Soviet Union, or indeed in many Marxist-Leninist states and regimes, but it became more associated with anarchist movements, but it then re-emerged, if you like, in 1968 and in the revival of communism, or a particular type of communism in that period. So in a way, those are the stories I will be. That's the main argument of my analysis. Now, to come to the first legacy, the modernising legacy, and if we could come on to that, this sort of revolutionary modernising. Oh, yeah, sorry, we're not quite there yet, but anyway. Okay, now it's the first workerist modernising vision we see in Pudovkin, and it came to dominate visions of the 1920s, precisely in that period. And I think the workerist modernising vision of communism became important because really for the whole communist period from the 1920s, but particularly for economic reasons. And I think it became important globally and outside Russia because of the crisis of the international order in the late 1920s. Now, as one, as of course is well known, that in the 1920s there was an attempt to create a liberal market order based on global finance, really supported by the Americans in the 1920s. That failed in 1929, and particularly in the USSR and in many developing countries, there was a sense also that this liberal order was not really helping them develop. In the USSR itself, it became increasingly common to argue that there was a need to return to revolutionary values, that capitalism was keep holding them back developmentally. Also, within the West, many intellectuals became increasingly attracted to communism in the 1930s because, again, it seemed that capitalism had failed, that there was a need for a more radical form of state intervention in the economy. And the development of a sort of Stalinist alternative to capitalism, the command economy, the planned economy from 1929, for many on the left, that seemed to be a solution to the problems of capitalism. So I think, in a way, there's a whole period from the late 1920s, 1930s, up until the 1970s and 80s, really, 1970s, I suppose, when there was a sense that this sort of lessons had to be learned from the crisis of markets, and therefore state planning and this workerist, egalitarian, modernising form of socialism seemed to be a plausible solution to economic problems. Another crucial shift at this period, though, is that, in a sense, of course, this vision of communism as a planning, command economies was very technocratic. It didn't seem very revolutionary at all. I mean, often it wasn't really very revolutionary. It was really about state planning. It was about experts in charge of the economy, running things without much democratic participation. And that, in a way, for many, came to be seen what communism was about. Many thought that's what communism was about, a sort of technocratic modernising project. However, something we often forget is that actually it was again in this period, in the late 20s and 30s, that some Bolsheviks tried to, or some communists tried to transfer the idea of revolution to the sphere of economics. Now, firstly, communists claimed that they could engineer a revolutionary leap to modernity. And the late 1920s, with the rise of Stalin, was the time of the first of several great breaks. It was called the period of the Great Break, a revolutionary break in the economy, a sense that somehow great efforts, great revolutionary mobilization could lead to great economic achievements. And we see those great leaps forward, if you like, in China in the late 50s, in Bulgaria and elsewhere in many countries, this sense that somehow if you mobilize working class energies and peasant energies enough, then somehow you can achieve great things. And here is a picture of that type of revolutionary economics. This is Stakhanovites. The Stakhanovites were allegedly hero revolutionary workers who worked so hard and with such revolutionary enthusiasm that they would achieve great economic leaps forward. And this is an Estonian poster. The Stakhanovite guarantees the continuing peace. As you see, it's this Stakhanovite attacking the bourgeois, the bourgeois world. Now, so in a way, what we see is that there is a continuation in communist politics of the revolutionary element of October, but in the economic sphere. And throughout the communist history, we find a sort of a tension between a technocratic, if I could have the next, a technocratic emphasis on planning, modernization, and a revolutionary emphasis on the mobilized people who can achieve great things through revolutionary action. So here is a picture of the Soviets giving their great economic expertise to the Chinese communists, and you see a factory in the background. And here we find, yes, the revolutionary politics. So even after the revolution had happened, the revolution, if you like, often continues in communist politics. And that is associated with a whole lot of other things, like class struggle, like often a rather Manichaean view of politics. That is a sense of the true believers who've got to, the only way to make communism work is for everybody to believe in communism, because only believers in communism will really work hard and really be committed to making it work. And there are the unbelievers, the people who are influenced by bourgeois ideas, and they will sabotage communism, they will undermine it. And so we find this, it doesn't happen all the time in communist politics. In fact, it often only happens for short episodes in communist politics. Of course, they're very famous, those episodes. The Stalinist terror, the Great Leap Forward, the Cultural Revolution, Pol Pot's Kampuchea. These are all very famous episodes in communist history. They're often for rather short periods, and they often produce enormous bloodshed, violence, chaos. But they tend to be they tend to finish in a sort of violence, in a chaos, and then usually the regimes return to this rather more technocratic, rather more hierarchical form of governance in which the party and experts are in control and order is reimposed. So that is, in a way, the main legacy, as I said. So we're going back to the main legacy of October is this revolutionary modernization legacy, the notion of the proletarian revolutionary modernizer, the Pudovkin image. But there is, if you like, a tension between these two aspects of it. Now, to come on to the second image, the second vision of October, is, can we go to the next one? I think that's right, yeah. This is as I said, the second vision is the agrarian war, the peasant war. And this became very important in the second half of the 20th century this became much more important in the second half of the 20th century with the emergence of communism and communist regimes in East Asia and in the global south. And here we have a picture of the Chinese, the Red Army in the People's Liberation Army in China in 1949 entering Beijing. And as you see, they're very much a peasant army and look as if they've just come from the countryside. And it's understandable that communism would have moved its emphasis away from proletarian revolution to industrialization, to an emphasis on trying to appeal to peasants and peasant mobilization and issues of land reform, and very much this was the case in East Asia, in the third world. Now, actually, it was happening very much even before then. The idea of the revolution being about a peasant war was something that was increasingly emphasized, interestingly, in the 1930s in the Soviet Union. One of the most influential representations of this idea was in the film, if we could go back again, was in the film Chapayev of 1934. Now, this was an incredibly popular film in the Soviet Union. It's actually shown today in Russia. It's actually quite a watchable film. It's an adventure film, which is the story of an uneducated peasant leader in the Civil War who gradually is mentored, is educated by a party official, and ultimately acquires revolutionary consciousness, a sort of classic story in socialist culture. But at the heart of the film lies not the party official, but this rather, in the film, attractive figure of Chapayev, who is a big-hearted, generous figure, who has sort of rough and ready heroism. This film was shown throughout the socialist world and became a model for many peasant guerrilla films. Indeed, it was one of the 4 films that the Chinese communist Zhou Enlai brought back from Moscow to show to the Chinese communist guerrillas in their base in Yan'an in the 1940s. And you can see the heirs of this type of film in the very popular, again, films of World War II films that were produced. And again, many of those films were shown to revolutionaries in the global south in the 60s and 70s. And it was this conception of revolution, if we try and think about what revolutionaries thought about, what global south revolutionaries in the 60s, 70s, even 80s thought about the communist revolution. They probably didn't think very much about workers and Lenin very much, actually. They thought about these war films. I have a colleague in Oxford who's studying the African guerrilla leaders in Zimbabwe. And they went to communist training camps run by the Chinese and by the Soviets, and the Chinese were showing them this type of, they were seeing this type of film about World War II, about heroism, about peasant heroism. They weren't seeing films about Lenin. And what, of course, was different, and so it's this conception of revolution that became important. And, of course, the other thing that was important in this period was the concept of revolution as an anti-imperial force. And I think we can see a sort of a second, if the first major phase of communist revolution was in the aftermath of World War I in Russia, but also in Central Europe. Yes, there was some revival of communism in the 1930s with the crises, the economic crises, but there were no major new communist breakthroughs politically. The next major communist breakthrough was with World War II. And that was very much connected, partly in China and in East Asia, with peasant wars and peasant issues, but it was mainly connected with anti-imperialism. So it was in this period that the anti-imperial element, the anti-imperial vision of October became important. Now, interestingly, the anti-imperial vision is seen in Europe as well as in Asia, because the Germans created an empire in Europe, and so in places like Czechoslovakia we find a sort of sense that this was a sort of racist and colonizing power, and only the communists would fight them. But actually it was in Asia and in the need to fight against the Japanese and also the European empires. And the communists were able to present themselves as being people who were committed to military action. So it was the military side of things that was appealing there. It was the anti-imperial side. It was the idea that the communists were very well organised, and that the communists also were not going to make any concessions to the sort of capitalist, the so-called compradors, the capitalist figures who had collaborated with various empires, and often they did collaborate with various empires, with the Japanese or the Europeans. So this whole notion of anti-imperial communism, of peasant war communism, had sort of new life, if you like, in the global south after World War II. And according to this view of communism, peasant guerrilla armies would seize power in what was fundamentally a military victory. We see communist insurgencies throughout East Asia after World War II, Vietnam, Korea, the Philippines, and of course China. They succeeded in some places. China, North Korea, North Vietnam, not other places. And of course, yes, they argued that after the victory, they would then introduce this developmental model of involving the creation of a new working class, the creation of industry and planning and the command economy. Now, the early 50s and to the mid-60s was a period of rather effective American counteroffensive against these revolutions. And we find, of course, the Korean War, defeat of the communists in the Korean War, defeat of various insurgencies, Malaysia, the Philippines, the defeat of various potentially communist-inspired or regimes that might become communist. So the Americans are involved in various various coups around the world to try and prevent left-wing nationalists coming to power who might collaborate with communists. Guatemala, for instance, I suppose Iran as well. And this is in a way a highly, one could say, precautionary way of dealing with communism. One could say it was a paranoid way of dealing with communism. But whatever you think about American policy, communism was rather effectively constrained or limited in this period. I suppose the first break in that was with the Cuban Revolution of 1959, and that's sparked off a number of communist insurgencies throughout Latin America. But really it was only in the late 60s that we find communists in a much stronger position. Now, much of that was to do with American attempts and failures to defeat the communists in Vietnam. And that was a crucial break in American power after 1968 in particular. So clearly international politics was important here in explaining the revival of communism in the late 60s and 70s. But I think there are other issues as well, other important issues, which is to do with generational change. In many countries in the global south, a new generation of more radical nationalists believed that the first generation of nationalist leaders, the left-wing nationalists, the so-called Bandung generation after the Bandung Conference, which involving people like Nehru, Sukarno, and Nasser, these are the first generation of left-wing socialist nationalists. They were not communists. They were trying to develop their own local forms of socialism, which they were trying to be non-aligned between East and West, and they promised not only independence, but also a lot of social reform and development. Now that, by the late 60s, for a new generation of nationalists in the global south, that appeared to have failed. These were leaders who were thought not to have achieved the equality or the wealth that they had promised, and in particular, these radical nationalists believed that their countries were held back by compromises with the old feudal forces of landowners, priests, mullahs, the comprador merchants who were collaborating with international imperialist powers. And so we find again a huge sympathy for communism among this new generation of nationalists in the global south. And it seemed that China and then Cuba had created a sort of model of guerrilla-based revolution and revolutionary industrialization that might actually be an alternative to this, this nationalist socialism. Now, the high point was, if we could go on to the next one, was the next one, yeah, the Tricontinental Conference in Havana in 1966, hosted by the Cubans. As you see, it was very much a vision of communism of the global south with different, clearly it is not about the global north at all. This was a new vision of communism that was trying to separate itself from the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union was seen in this period by these groups of people, and some of them were allied with the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union was helping them. The Soviet Union was helping the Cubans. But the Soviet Union was increasingly seen as a rather unrevolutionary technocratic place, which was really about central planning and hierarchies. It was not really about a revolutionary a particularly revolutionary model. So this is a new vision of a sort of revolutionary communism. Now, this was some were allied with USSR, some were allied with Cuba, some with China, which of course have broken away from the Soviet Union, and there have been a major split between China and the Soviet Union. So we find splits within communism, but both the Soviet Union, China, and Cuba internationally were faced with a revival, a rise of very revolutionary sentiments which supported a revolutionary form of communism. Now, this type of communism was probably most successful in those places which still were involved in anti-colonial wars. If we could go to the next one. This is a war you know about, I'm sure, in Portugal, but many other colonial wars and anti-colonial wars in Africa as well. The ANC in South Africa was very much connected. The Communist Party was extremely strong within the ANC in Africa. I suppose one of the most successful regions for this type of communism was in Portuguese Africa. Now, there were... So if we think about the visions of October that this type of communism was using, it was using a vision of revolution, yes, of radicalism. It was using a vision of peasant war. It was using a vision of anti-feudalism, and it was using a vision of anti-colonialism as well. On the issue of peasant versus industry, peasant and, is this really about workers? Is it about peasants? Is it about industrialization? Well, actually, there were big differences between different types of movements on this. The worker-oriented, the peasant-oriented. At the more peasant-oriented end, we find Mao's cultural revolution. Mao increasingly thought that peasants had to be mobilized, that they were being disadvantaged by a much excessive emphasis on industry. We also find a very ruralist, peasant-oriented vision of communism in Kampuchea, in the Khmer Rouge. In fact, it was such a peasant-oriented approach that it involved emptying the towns the towns were seen as places that were full of enemies, full of potential enemies, full of aliens. So that's at the more ruralist end. At the more urbanist end, I suppose we find some of the most urbanist visions and workerist visions of revolution, of October, in Africa, so-called Afro Stalinism, as it's sometimes being called, connected with the Ethiopian regime of Colonel Mengistu, who believed that the Russian example was highly relevant to them because they had a sort of they had their own imperial aristocratic traditions. Also, they are a Christian Orthodox country, and so they felt that they had a lot in common with the Russia of 1917. So Colonel Mengistu of Ethiopia believed that this was a in a way that the Russian experience could be copied and industry had to be built. We find other types of African regimes as well, which are very interested in, seriously industrializing the country. The Mozambican regime, for instance, was quite serious in its efforts to industrialize the country. Yet, despite these differences, so there are big differences between all of these regimes, but I think all of these different alliances of different forces throughout the global south all subscribe to a vision of October, which was pretty similar. It was about modernity, it was about revolution, it was about some sort of equality. Even the Khmer Rouge in Kampuchea, anti-urban as they were, somehow believed that they were going to create some great industrial leap forward. It was a bit unclear how they were going to do that, but somehow they did think they were going to do it. Now, it was this amalgam, if you like, that we see very much in the global south. I think, if you like, the October amalgam of visions that I see, that I explained at the beginning, if you like, the first four visions of October, not the fifth, not the Bohemian one, but the first four visions of October remain pretty intact in the global south in the 1960s and 1970s. It's actually in the West, if you like, that in the developed world, where that amalgam breaks apart, comes under serious strain. And I think it's 1968 where we see the 60s in Europe and in America, where we see, if you like, the decline in these legacies of October, or the emergence of a particular legacy, which is actually the Bohemian legacy. Now, if we could move on to the next picture. Now, May 68, of course, in some ways was a revival of the legacies of October. So this is the Sorbonne. So we see the pictures of the figures of Lenin, Marx, and Mao, and so we find these sort of 60s. And quite a lot of these are pretty sort of thick slogans that you might have seen would you have seen all of these slogans in 1917? You might have seen some of them. You wouldn't have seen this one, or this one. You would have seen this one, perhaps. These posters were modelled on the big character posters of Maoist China. This notion of occupying factories, Lenin, Marx, in a way was something which would have been recognised in 1917 as part of the proletarian workerist revolution. And in many ways, the 1968 generation were using that legacy. So if we think about Joschka Fischer, later German foreign minister in the 1990s, he was involved in mobilising workers in the Opel plant, and many 1960s activists were involved in worker mobilisation. They were interested in working class participatory democracy in factories. However, increasingly, I would say the more important aspect of the 1968, in a way, 1968, of course, was very divided between different forms of the left, as notoriously fragmented. The thing which probably united the different groups most was anti-imperialism. Some were rather more traditional workerists, but there was also a very strong strain of the fifth vision, the Bohemian avant-garde vision. In some ways, they had more in common with the Kandinskys, with the Dada movement, which George Grosz was interested in. That is, rather, they saw revolution as a radical break with a rule-bound and materialistic bourgeoisie, which they believed undermined individual creativity and authenticity. In some ways, they were hostile to the anti-feudal hierarchies. They were like the old anti-feudalism. They were hostile to old hierarchies, but they saw those hierarchies in different ways. They saw them very much in terms of hierarchies of education, as you see, the end of the university. They were particularly concerned with hierarchies of professors and students, and that's why they found Mao so appealing, because Mao was involved in the Cultural Revolution in an attack on Confucianism and particularly an attack on intellectuals and the Confucian traditions of giving a great authority to intellectuals, to teachers, and that's what they particularly found appealing. And so if we think about the Little Red Book, Mao's Little Red Book, which was so popular among 60s revolutionaries, radicals in Europe, much of the Little Red Book was about issues of democratization of culture and education. There was not so much about industrialization, about industrial modernization, about those issues. And indeed, this aspect of 1917 was increasingly unpopular among 60s revolutionaries. So, famous works by people like Herbert Marcuse, who was an important thinker on the left in that period, his famous One-Dimensional Man, compared both the West and the Soviet bloc, as accused both of them of being totalitarian because they were technocratic. They were run by experts, they were planned societies. It was this aspect of 1917 that the 60s radicals were very ambivalent about. Not all of them, but some of them. The other thing which some 60s radicals were ambivalent about was revolutionary violence, which was associated with a sort of machismo, with militarism. So 1968, while an ambivalent period and a divided period, and the radicals were divided, while appearing to be a revival of the Legacies of October, was actually a major factor in its decline in the politics of the West. And showed an increase, and there was an increasing divergence. In 1968, there was, I think, already evident a divergence between the traditional old left that adopted the first four legacies of the first four visions of October I identified, and the new left, which was rather more interested, apart from anti-imperialism, was more interested in the fifth, the Bohemian, the creative, the idea of individual authenticity. And that continued throughout the 1970s. I suppose the Portuguese Revolution was an example of one of the last. Again, both types of left were involved in that revolution, but the old left was defeated. The rather more orthodox left was defeated in the aftermath of that period. And so I think, yes, in the 70s we see that helps to explain the decline of October, or at least most of the legacies of October. And that was reinforced in the late 70s and 80s by the return with a vengeance of the global order of the mid-1920s. That is one based on international finance. And so for many communists in the global south, they made rather radical switches from this radical revolutionary anti-colonialism to a pro-market position. Because if you are in favour of national modernisation and in competing with the West, or trying to catch up with the West in terms of economic growth, then you've got to make compromises with the world of banks, private capital and trade. And it was that increasingly that offered the promise of national economic development, not states and communist planning. And after the adoption of market reforms by China from the late 1970s, and in a way the crises of confidence in communist planning in the 80s, many communist countries and many communists were losing faith in that model and were feeling they had to increasingly, there's partly debt as well, they were forced by the IMF, by the World Bank, to adopt more market-oriented policies. And by the 1990s, many communists, with the fall of communism, many former communists had become effectively pro-market capitalists. So Thabo Mbeki, who was a communist under the ANC, in 1996 said, "Just call me a Thatcherite." And interestingly, in this period, we find the image of revolution, the visions of revolution, being adopted by neoliberals. We find that first, interestingly, in Reagan's speech to the British Parliament in 1980, where he says, it's an interesting speech, he says that actually capitalism is the Marxism of today, because it's the revolutionary force. Marxism is a conservative old force, capitalism is the new force of today. And we find that image of revolution being adopted by pro-capitalist forces. And if we could go to the next one. Now, this is a figure you probably don't know. He's a British entrepreneur, a rather controversial, let's say, British entrepreneur called Richard Branson. But here we find him presented as a business revolutionary. So, in a way, these trends have continued today. We have found the old left of the global south moving to varieties of market-friendly technocracy, while among the Western left, we have found the rise of really the influence of the new left. Post-68 approaches have become even stronger, and in a way, a greater emphasis rather than on socioeconomic equality with other forms of hierarchy like gender, ethnicity, sexuality. In a way, that has only become stronger and stronger with each generation, I think, of the left since the 60s. Now, in the West, the shift can be explained in various ways, and I know I'm coming to an end. This shift can be explained in various ways. Partly it's ideological. It seems that in a way the old communism ignored the gender hierarchies and other hierarchies which the left wanted to challenge. However, also this is to do, I think, new sociological conditions, clearly. It's also to do with a new higher educated left, which is more interested in issues of individual authenticity, individual self-expression, rather than collective struggles. And this sociological change is not so evident in the global south, and that may explain why the post-60s new left is not so powerful there. Rather, we see a number of regimes on right and left that are committed to some form of market-friendly, though often rather crony capitalist modernisation, whether the right nationalists, BJP in India, AKP in Turkey, Putinist Russia, or on the left, we find Angolan communists, Chinese communists. China, I've just returned from, very much trying to create a new non-Marxist authoritarian left, melding weirdly Confucianism and socialism. So they're very much trying to keep Mao in some way as a sort of Marxist or a sort of communist, but actually trying to mix him with Confucianism, which of course Mao was violently opposed to. So I think this, in a way, gets to the root of the crisis of the left today. And I'm not telling you anything I'm sure you don't know, which is that if 1917 was a loose amalgam of different processes and different visions of socialism, all bound together by a commitment to a narrative of modernisation and socio-economic equality, now that coalition is broken. And on the one side, we have the modernisers, if you like, the industrial modernisers, who are either old left but are increasingly on the nationalist right. And on the other side, we have the post-60s new left, who are interested in other forms of hierarchy, or have been more interested in other forms of hierarchy rather than class issues, and certainly are highly sceptical of modernisation and industrial modernisation. In large part, of course, in recent years, because of the environmental concerns with that and the notion that that actually industrial modernisation cannot be sustained anymore, given the environmental constraints. But they are also, as I said, concerned with other inequalities other than economic inequalities. However, and this is going to be my concluding point, I suppose, which is that I think, since the financial crisis, it may be that those two, that the visions of communism may finally come together in some way, in a rather different amalgam. We may find that, clearly since the financial crisis, the weaknesses of financialized capitalism have helped to unite those two groups in some minor ways. Now, I certainly find that clearly societies are highly divided in the West, and particularly between educated, those who have a higher education, those who do not have a higher education. But at least among the higher educated groups, those with university education, there seems to be greater awareness of socioeconomic issues. Now, this is partly from personal experience. My students, I would say, who are very committed to post-1960s New Left issues, or on the left, that is, those on the left tend to be committed to gender equality, ethnic equality, sexuality equality, but they're becoming increasingly interested in socioeconomic equality as well. And in a way, there is a revival of this unified left, in a way which was not really the case in the 90s. Also, the environmental crisis may lead to serious attempts to establish new forms of global political structures which control financial markets, and establish a political consensus on these issues. And that may help to unite different left-wing groups in North and South. So there are various forces which may be helping to combine the different forms of the left in North and South. Now, I think things look a bit better for the left in the global West, if you like, than it does in the global South, or indeed in Eastern Europe, where the left is still quite weak. In Latin America, I suppose we still do find what we might call a sort of post-1917 left, as well as a post-60s left. So in a way, Latin America may be the closest there is to a sort of a Western European situation. But I think whatever happens, I think it's unlikely that October 1917 itself is going to play a major role in this unification of the left if it happens. I think the vision presented in the Kudovkin film poster of workers, militarized revolution, and grand projects of modernization, I think is unlikely to be used much in a founding myth for any revival of the left. But we certainly are seeing a sort of revival of the left, as of course we are seeing a revival of the nationalist right at the same time. And I think we at least can't rule out the fact that certain aspects of that amalgam of visions of October will not re-emerge in some form in the future as the left becomes stronger in the West, particularly, as I think it will. So thank you very much, and sorry to have gone over my time.